Hi, everyone who just joined. Welcome to today's member program, exploring Nazi-looted art and the Lady in Gold with attorney and Jewish Gen board member Randol Schoenberg. I'm Jory Sheriff, Senior Manager for Membership Initiatives. Before we get started, I just want to thank you all for your membership support, which has been so meaningful over these last several months and truly makes programs like this one possible. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our incredible guest, Randol Schoenberg, who specializes in legal cases relating to the recovery of looted or stolen artworks, particularly those by the Nazi regime during the Holocaust. Mr. Schoenberg represented Maria Altmann in her lawsuit to recover 6 Gustav Klimt paintings that were stolen by the Nazis from Ferdinand and Adele Bloch-Bauer, who are distant relatives of Maria Altmann. Mr. Schoenberg has received numerous accolades for his work, including the California Lawyer Attorney of the Year Award in 2007 for outstanding achievement in litigation practice. And if being a top litigator isn't enough of an accomplishment, he also served as president of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust from 2005 to 2015. He currently lectures at the Gould School of Law at the University of Southern California. Today, Randy will share his research and experience working on this fascinating case for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. At any point during the presentation, you can type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to compile them when it's time for us to have a conversation. So without further ado, please welcome Randol Schoenberg.
Hi, everyone. I'm here in Los Angeles and happy to be speaking to you today, unfortunately virtually, but thanks for tuning in. This is an old story for me, but people seem to still be interested, so that makes me pretty happy. So without further ado, let's get into the story. I'm going to be looking a little bit over to the side because I have 2 screens and I put the slides on the other screen there, so forgive me for that. I'll try to speak directly to you, but really the pictures are the good things to look at. So here's the story of the recovery of these amazing Klimt paintings from Austria. Let's start with my client, Maria Altmann. Maria, pictured here outside her pool in Los Angeles with a replica of the painting, and then there's an older picture that I actually found in my grandmother's things. Maria and my grandmother were best friends. We're very close friends here in Los Angeles. As I'll explain, both families arrived in Los Angeles after fleeing the Nazis from Vienna, first to other places, and then arrived in LA around 1942. Each of them had their oldest child in 1940. And so my mother, who was an only child, really grew up with the Altmann kids. There were 4 children that Maria and her husband Fritz had as sort of her surrogate siblings. They went on vacations together, and Maria was just at every family event that I can remember growing up. So it's literally true when I say that she's known me since my mother was in diapers, and she really was almost a member of the family. So representing her really was a very natural thing for me, and as you'll see, sort of one of the of course the highlight of my professional career. So let's go back and give some background to her story. Maria came from a very prominent and wealthy family in Vienna. And let me give you a little history. The Jews were not given full civil rights in Austria until 1867. That's a little bit after the US Civil War. And at that time, Austria was a world empire. I think 12 or 13 current countries, at least parts of them, were part of that Austro-Hungarian empire. And after 1848, and especially after 1867, Jews were then allowed to come into Vienna and live in Vienna. And so they basically flooded in from the outlying areas, and it coincided with an era of growth in Vienna, where they built the famous boulevard, the Ringstrasse, and all these big fabulous buildings. It's sort of the end of that industrial revolution. And so some of the Jews who came to Vienna at that time became fabulously wealthy. Obviously not all of them. There were many, many poor Jews living in Vienna at that time, but 2 of the families that really made it rich during that time are the Blochs and the Bauers. The Blochs were into sugar production from their homeland in Bohemia, and they formed something called the Austrian Sugar Industry Corporation, which almost had a monopoly on sugar production from beets, obviously not from sugarcane in that part of the world. And the Bauers were into banking and railroads. And so these two fabulously wealthy families combined. Here you see on the screen Maria's parents, Gustav Bloch-Bauer, who was an attorney, and his wife, Teresa, and they are the older siblings of Ferdinand and Adele. So two brothers named Bloch married two sisters named Bauer. And when the sisters had a brother who died young, there was no other Bauer, so they combined the names Bloch-Bauer, right? They took two very ordinary names, put a hyphen in between, and become sort of fancy. So the Bloch-Bauer family were two sets of siblings who married each other. The older ones, if I can go back to Gustav and Teresa, had 5 children, and Maria was sort of an accident baby. Her older sister was 8 years older, and then she had 3 older brothers from there up. So she was really the baby of the family. And her uncle and aunt, Ferdinand and Adele, who were younger than Gustav and Teresa, unfortunately had no children. Adele, I think, had several pregnancies that ended with stillborn babies, and really tragic. So I always like to think that as a result of not being able to have children, they turned to art collecting, because they had a fabulous art collection. And let me show you where they put it. This is their home in Vienna on the Elisabethstrasse. If you've been to Vienna, it's sort of a block and a half away from the opera. You go one block outside of the ring and then make a right, and there you are at the Bloch-Bauer Palais. So it's a very, very prominent location in Vienna. And in this building, they had the offices of the sugar company and their home on one floor. And they collected lots and lots of artworks. Ferdinand was more conservative, I think, in his taste. And so you have a lot of these, what are called Biedermeier paintings from the 19th century, and a Rodin sculpture. They had dozens of artworks like this. They also had the largest collection of antique Austrian porcelain in the world, over 300 settings. So each cup and saucer is a setting. Really magnificent. It had already been published in the 20s. This is just a tiny example. And then, of course, you know, if you're rich, you have to have a summer house. So this is their tiny cottage outside of Prague. One really interesting sideline, especially for this audience, this house was taken over during the Nazi period by the Nazis and used as the residence for what they called the Reichsprotector of Bohemia Moravia. First, it was a guy named Konstantin von Neurath, but then he was moved around and replaced by Reinhard Heydrich. So for those of you who do not know, Reinhard Heydrich would be on anybody's top 5 Nazi list. He was the architect of the final solution, the one who held the famous Wannsee conference in another Jewish home in Berlin. He was living in this house, in the Bloch-Bauer house, at the time of the Wannsee conference. He went up to Berlin, plotted the extermination of the Jews, came back. A few weeks later, he was traveling into Prague and was assassinated by 2 Czech partisans. And it's an incredible story. There's several films that have been made about that. The Nazis then retaliated they thought that these partisans were kept in a town called Lidice, and they went to Lidice and basically wiped out the entire town. The men were all killed. The women and kids were sent to concentration camps. It's a very famous episode in the Holocaust, but it relates then to this castle. But let's get back to Vienna and the Klimt paintings. At the time that Ferdinand and Adele were married, the most famous, the most expensive painter in Austria was this Gustav Klimt. He was probably the best draftsman of his time. He went up through the academy and gained notoriety, had oodles of public commissions on these big new buildings they were building, but then decided that he was tired of that and became a little bit more modern, turned away from the academy, formed something called the Secession, which has a beautiful building in Vienna, then got tired of his friends in the Secession and went out on his own and independently became sort of the most famous painter in Austria at that time, the most sought after. And he did, his patrons were largely this sort of nouveau riche Jewish high bourgeoisie, the people like the Bloch-Bauers, but also the Zuckerkandel family or the Lederer family. I think those 3 families bought maybe a third of his entire output. So Ferdinand hired Klimt to do a portrait of his young wife Adele. He did hundreds and hundreds of sketches over a number of years. These are just a few of them for that portrait, and then finally came up with the very justly famous painting in 1907, the gold portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. It's inspired by Klimt having taken a trip to Ravenna, Italy, where he saw mosaics and decided to sort of replicate that mosaic style. I think there are only 3 or 4 paintings in this gold leaf style that Klimt did, and the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer maybe is second to the Kiss in fame, but it's apparently the best preserved of all of those paintings. So you can see it in New York if the museum's open again. Anyway, there it is. So there's another portrait he did of Adele just 5 years later in 1912. And I have to say, there was a rumor at the time that Klimt did these portraits that he was having an affair with Adele. And Maria even said that she asked her mother, is it true what they say about Adele? And her mother said, of course not. And Maria sort of dismissed that, saying, well, she would have said that even if it were true. But the scholars say whatever heat was on between Adele and Klimt at this time was clearly off by the time that he painted the much cooler and reserved painting in 1912. Klimt was famous for being sort of a Lothario, and he painted, you can see the picture of him here in this long smock, apparently with nothing on underneath. And he sired 18 illegitimate kids. At least those were the ones that appeared when he died in 1918 during the last big flu epidemic, by the way, at age only 50. So the Bloch-Bauers had purchased other paintings by Klimt. This is the birch tree or beechwood. It has different titles depending on which trees you look at. Apple trees, this was probably painted when Klimt was a guest of the Bloch-Bauers at their summer home outside of Prague. This is slightly unfinished if you look at the lower right corner. So it was probably purchased out of Klimt's estate in 1918. The house is in Untrach am Attersee, and then they had this gorgeous Schlosskammer am Attersee, the third of 4 paintings on this lake in Austria, absolutely gorgeous. So they had those 6 paintings, and then unfortunately Adele died very young. She was 43 years old in 1925, and she had handwritten a will just 2 years later after the death of her mother, and her father had already died. Probably she was assisted by Maria's father, who was the lawyer in the family, and he's named as the executor in the will. And if I can point out to you, in the lower right corner of that second page, it says, my 2 portraits and the 4 landscapes of Gustav Klimt, bitte ich meine Ehegatten. That means I ask my husband, please, after his death, to give these to the Austrian State Gallery in Vienna. And at the same time, she wants him to give the library that they have in Vienna and outside of Prague to the People's and Workers' Library. So let's go through that. Adele was a very civic-minded, some would call her a socialite. She was involved in political life in Austria at that time, which had a new socialist government. And she really wanted, I think, to support the new institutions, which included the Austrian Gallery, which was the new public gallery made out of one of the old Habsburg palaces, and which was for Austrian art. So she wanted her husband, after his death, to give her 2 portraits and the 4 landscapes to this gallery. And then she made other bequests to various civic organizations. After Adele died, Ferdinand purchased this other painting. So he had 7 paintings for a while, and then he gave this Schlosskammer am Attersee picture in 1936, he gave that to the Austrian Gallery Museum. So he ended up with 6, but not the same 6 that are mentioned in Adele's will, which always causes confusion for people. I should add this, Amalia Zuckerkandel was murdered in the Holocaust in Belzec along with her daughter. That painting that belonged to Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer has still not been returned. It's a whole long story, but we're still trying to get that back. It's hanging in the Austrian Gallery. It was never returned to the Bloch-Bauers, partly because her family claimed that it should have been returned to them, even though it was in Ferdinand's home and obviously owned by him. So it's still a problematic painting. So Maria got married in 1937, December. She called it the last great Jewish wedding in Vienna. And she married Fritz Altmann, who was a little bit older. She was just 21 years old. And Fritz was the much younger brother of a very wealthy sweater manufacturer named Bernhard Altmann, who made cashmere sweaters and things like that, and had a big factory in Vienna. And they went on their honeymoon to the Italian Alps, you can see there, and Maria returned home and then had her on February 18th, her 22nd birthday. And then in March 13th, just 3 weeks later, the Nazis invaded and annexed Austria in the famous Anschluss in March of 1938. And so from one day to the next, Maria went from sort of on top of the world, wealthy young wife, to being a pariah in new Nazi Austria. So what happened to the family? Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer fled immediately to Switzerland. Sorry, still early in the morning, I guess here. Sorry, he fled first to Prague, to his home, and then ultimately to Switzerland when the Nazis were invading Prague a year later. And he never actually returned to Vienna. He died in Switzerland in 1945, never having seen any of his family, his nieces and nephews, and never recovering any of his property. The rest of Maria's family managed to escape. The three brothers ended up in Canada, in Vancouver, Canada. Maria's older sister had been married to a Baron Gutmann who had an estate in Croatia. So they went to Croatia thinking they would be safe. But then, of course, the Ustasha, the Nazi-affiliated Croatians, took over that area and deported all the Jews to Auschwitz. Maria's sister was able to persuade someone to hide her and her husband and two young children. And they actually survived the war in hiding in Yugoslavia, were liberated when Tito's army liberated Yugoslavia, and then her husband was arrested for being a capitalist. So imagine being Jewish and surviving the Holocaust. He was arrested by the communists and then executed for crimes of capitalism. So Maria's sister then fled to Palestine in 1947, I think. So she was there during the creation of the State of Israel with her two children, and then moved to Vancouver, Canada, where she joined the brothers. Maria and Fritz, if you saw the movie Woman in Gold, you saw sort of a reenactment of their story, but it was incomplete. What happened was that Fritz, I mentioned his older brother, was this Bernhard Altmann. Bernhard Altmann also, like Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, fled immediately as the Nazis were coming into Austria, knowing that he would be a target. He was sort of a business genius, and he wired all of his customers in his textile business not to send any money to Vienna, but just to wire it to him. And so he then collected all the money that was owed to his firm and then went to England and said, I'd like to set up a new business in England. And the British invited him right in, and he set up a new factory in Liverpool. In retaliation, the Nazis then arrested Fritz, his younger brother, Maria's new husband, and sent him to Dachau, where he was for several months over that summer in 1938, until his older brother Bernhard was able to pay ransom and get his brother out of Dachau. And so Fritz was released from Dachau, and then they planned the escape, which you saw in the film, where they faked an appointment at a dentist and then made their way to the airport, where they flew to Cologne, and from there had to make their way across the border into Holland, where they, which was not easy because they would be considered illegal aliens. The Dutch were actually returning Jews who were trying to escape into Holland. So they had to bribe a priest who helped them come across the border. That priest was later captured and murdered by the Nazis. But they made it into Holland, where Bernhard Altmann picked them up and flew them to safety in England. He then quickly sent them on to Fall River, Massachusetts, where Bernhard was building yet another factory for textiles, and they lived there for a couple of years before moving out to California when the war started, because Fritz wanted to be involved in fighting the Nazis, and he ended up working in the aerospace. And so that's how she came to California. So what happened to the Klimt paintings during that time? Well, here you see a document from a meeting that was held in 1939, in January 1939. So the families all fled by that time, and there was a Nazi lawyer named Dr. Erich Führer. His name was really Führer, and he had a meeting here with all of the authorities from the government and from the museums. And there were also representatives of Hitler there, because Hitler, as you may know, liked to dabble in art. He had tried to study art. If they'd just let him be an artist in the academy, the whole world would have been a better place. But when he became the head of the Nazis in Germany, he went around and had the right of first refusal from all of these Jewish collections. So he would send representatives to pick out what he liked. So Klimt was too modern for him. Oops, oh, I think I have it on the next slide. But he liked these old Biedermeier paintings, so he picked this Waldmüller painting of Count Esterhazy with a white rabbit, and that went into Hitler's collection. If you saw the movie Monuments Men, you saw how the US Army then recovered Hitler's collection and Goering's collection in salt mines in Salzburg, and this was among one of those paintings. So you can see in this list on the first page near the bottom, it starts with the Klimt paintings, and let me tell you what happened to all of those. It's a little complicated, so hold on to your seats. Dr. Führer made a trade with the Austrian gallery and traded the gold portrait in the apple tree to the Austrian gallery, but in return got back this Schlosskammer am Attersee that Ferdinand had already donated in 1936. So they had 2 for 1, and then the Austrian gallery bought the second portrait of Adela. So they ended up with 3 of the pictures, the 2 portraits in the apple tree. The beechwood went to the City Museum of Vienna, a different museum, was purchased by them. Houses in Unterach was kept by Dr. Führer along with 11 other paintings from the collection to pay himself for a job well done in liquidating the estate. So at the end, there were 3 paintings in the Belvedere, 1 in the City Museum, 1 in Dr. Führer's collection, and then that one that Ferdinand had already donated had gone back to Dr. Führer, and he then sold it to a guy named Gustav Uschitsky. Everybody's named Gustav in the story, I'm sorry. Gustav Uschitsky, who was he? He was a Nazi film director, very famous for a propaganda film called Heimkehr, or Returning Home, about the invasion of Poland, just to give you an idea. But he was also one of those 18 illegitimate children of Gustav Klimt, and so he used all the money he made from his propaganda films for the Nazis to buy up paintings that had been made by his father. So he ended up with this Schlosskammer am Attersee picture. So a little complicated. As I mentioned, the war ended, and Ferdinand died shortly thereafter in November 1945. When I first was working on this, I thought, well, why didn't he just waltz into Austria and get his property back? But I didn't realize that Austria was really devastated, and Vienna especially during the war, and was occupied then by the Americans and British and French and Russians for a number of years afterwards. And civilians were not allowed to return to Vienna until 1946, I believe. And it wasn't until 1948 that the first restitution laws came into effect in Austria. So Jewish families who had lost their property to the Nazis had to wait another 3 years before they could begin to get them back. And the Bloch-Bauers, now the heirs of Ferdinand, he left behind a will naming Maria, her sister, and one of Maria's brothers, Robert, as his heirs. It was their job in trying to recover as much as they could of Ferdinand's property, the house, the sugar company, the artworks, etc. And so they hired another Gustav, a friend of theirs, Dr. Gustav Rienesch, and he was the lawyer for the family and had the job of trying to track down these things and try to recover them under the new restitution laws. So in late 1947, he wrote to the Austrian gallery and said, I understand you may have some of the Klimt paintings that belong to the Bloch-Bauers. What's your position with regard to my client's restitution claims? Because the laws were about to go into effect. And the Austrian gallery wrote back in January 1948, what restitution claims? We were given these paintings under the will of Adele Bloch-Bauer. As a matter of fact, we're supposed to have 6 of them. We only have 3. And so it's your job to get the other 3 and deliver to them to us, or we were going to sue you. And they actually prepared to sue the Bloch-Bauers. So they took a very aggressive position regarding the will of Adele Bloch-Bauer. So let's go back to that and let me tell you a little bit more. When Adele died in 1925, there was sort of a probate proceeding that Maria's father, Gustav, had done. And he wrote a document in court that said some interesting things about this provision. It said, the Adela made certain requests which do not have the binding character of a testament. Nevertheless, her husband promises to fulfill her wishes, and he said it should be noted that the Klimt paintings were his property, not her property. So let's break that down. What does he mean when he says it's not binding? Well, in the law, when you deal with wills, obviously the person who is dead isn't there to tell you what they meant. And so there are rules of interpretation and requirements for wills that are very particular. And one of the issues is, when is something in a will just precatory language, meaning just a request and not an order? And the example I like to give is, let's say I had in my will, please, my wife, after I die, take care of the dog, okay? And I drop dead, and my wife says, thank goodness that dog is out of here. I never liked that dog anyway. That's probably okay, because I just said, please take care of the dog. It's not a command, it's just a request. If, on the other hand, I said, in order to receive a penny from my estate, you must agree to take care of our dog in the manner to which it's become a custom until its dying day, okay? That is an order, right? That's a command. And so the issue is always, is it just a request, please do this, or is it a command? Interestingly, before there was any dispute in 1926, Maria's father wrote, these are just a request. She's asking, please, her husband, after his death, to give the paintings to the museum. So they're not binding on him. Then it says, well, he promises to do it anyway. And the question is that a promise that is binding or not? And then he mentions, well, the paintings belong to him and not her. That's because we're dealing at that time with not a community property regime, but more separate property. They had a lot of property, each of them. Adela owned half the house. She had inherited a lot from her father, but apparently the paintings were considered in the family to be his property, not hers. So he could do with them what he wanted. And of course, when he died and left behind his will, it didn't give these paintings to the Austrian gallery in 1945, but instead gave his entire estate, which was nothing other than the hope of recovering property, to his nieces and nephew. So that was the situation that Dr. Rienisch was facing. And in 1948, he had a meeting with the authorities. And we know this because he reported to Maria's brother the next day and wrote exactly what had happened. And he said, you know, there was this law at the time that limited, it still exists and it predates the war, it limits the export of artworks from Austria if an artist is over 20 years dead. The Austrians can keep their patrimony inside of Austria. A lot of countries have these type of laws. And so what Austria was doing at that time, not just to the Bloch-Bauers, but to all of these Jewish families, the Austrian Rothschilds, for example, if the survivors who didn't live in Austria anymore wanted their property out of Austria, the Austrians would deny export permits. And then if you appealed, they would say, well, if you were to donate some of your artworks to our museums, we might let other things get out. And so there was all of this horse trading and extortion basically going on. So Dr. Rienisch had this meeting and reported to his client. He said, listen, I went to this meeting. They showed me the will of Adela, which may not mean what they say it is, but anyway, there's this promise. And so I made this deal. We won't fight over the Klimt paintings, but I'm hoping to get all of the other artworks out, all of the old Biedermeier paintings that he had recovered from Dr. Fuhrer and from the Monuments Men and things like that. And that worked, actually. He was able to export to his clients in Canada and Maria in Los Angeles a lot of these other artworks, but the Klimt paintings stayed in Vienna. And they stayed there until this case arose. In 1998, there were a series of articles by this brilliant journalist, Hubertus Czernin, who's really sort of a saint in all of this. He's famous actually for two other things. He's famous for uncovering the Nazi past of Kurt Waldheim, for those of you who remember that, the president of Austria who had and former UN General Secretary who had covered up his Nazi past. And he also covered the first priest sex abuse cases in Austria before that was even a thing here in the United States. So he was really a terrific journalist, died far too young of a terrible disease right at the end of this case in 2006. But he wrote a series of articles after there had been an exhibit in New York of paintings by Gustav Klimt, another artist who died in the flu epidemic in 1918. They were seized by the Manhattan DA, Robert Morgenthau, and that caused a big uproar in Austria. And the Austrian minister said, we don't have any looted paintings in our museums, it's ridiculous. And so he actually did the research and wrote a series of articles, an expose on the paintings that had been essentially donated in exchange for export permits after the war by these various formerly wealthy Austrian Jewish families. And that led the Austrians, to their credit, to enact a new law in September 1998 that was designed to return artworks that had been donated in this procedure, or artworks that had never been properly returned and somehow ended up in the museum. They just didn't want to have any of this taint on their federal collections. And that's really thanks to Hubertus that law was enacted. And when it was, then Maria called me up. I was a young lawyer, 31 years old, and working downtown at a big firm. And she tried to reach my mother, which would have been her first call, but my parents were actually in Vienna at the time. And she called me up and said, hi, this is Maria Altmann. I said, I know why you're calling, because you have to remember, you won't even remember how unusual this was, but because my parents were in Austria, I was looking online to try to see what was going on in Austria. And I had seen the announcement of this new law that mentioned the Klimt paintings. But at that time, you know, the New York Times and LA Times, I think, were just going online. It was just not a very common thing. It's amazing how the world has changed. But I said to her, I said, I know what you're calling about, because I was just looking to see what was going on while my parents were in Vienna. And I saw this article, and she said, well, let's meet and I'll tell you all about the Klimt painting. So I had known that there was this portrait of Maria's aunt. Well, the first time, I think I was 11 years old, or maybe when I was 15, and I went to the Austrian gallery, and my parents said, you know, you're Maria's friend, your grandmother's friend, Maria, that's her aunt, Adele Bloch-Bauer. So I knew it was a picture of her aunt, but I didn't know that the family had owned the paintings. I didn't know any of the history. And so she told me this fabulous history of these paintings and showed me some of the documents that she had recovered from her sister who had died earlier that year. And I looked at it and I said, you know, I think it falls under the new law. And so I agreed to represent her. I was still part of the big firm and help her through this, whatever process was going to come from this Austrian law. Well, it turned out it wasn't much of a process at all. The Austrians had decided they were going to sort of do this all on their own, without any interference from anybody else who might know something. And they set up a commission. And so I started writing to them, and they said, thank you very much, but we'll handle it. I even went there to meet with them, and they said, yeah, we can't really talk to you about anything. I called up one time the members of the board that were deciding things. He said, I could talk to you, but not about the case, that type of thing. So we had to wait, and in end of June 1999, they came out with a decision. They returned some drawings and porcelain, which had been traded as part of this export process, but they wouldn't return the Klimt paintings. And they said, we're not returning them because they were given to us under the will of Adele Bloch-Bauer. So I was very naive at the time, and you know, I wasn't an inheritance lawyer, but I looked at it and said, you know, this looks like it might not be binding. Maria's father thought it wasn't binding already in 1926. Dr. Rienisch, the other lawyer, thought it wasn't binding. Whoops, did I freeze? Am I back? Yeah, so Dr. Rienisch also thought it wasn't binding in 1948. So let's see if there's something to be done here. And we tried actually to find a lawyer and sue in Austria, but in Austria you have to pay in advance the potential court costs of the other side as sort of a bond. And it would have been more money than Maria had, much more. Many millions of dollars, because it's based on the value at stake in the case. And so we tried to reduce that, and they said, no, Maria, you don't have to give up your house, but you have to pay all of your other assets. So she was 85 years old, and they were asking her to give all of her savings account over to the Austrian court in order to file a lawsuit. So that was not, and actually Austria appealed that and wanted to make it more. So we said, okay, that's not going to happen. And I, again, very naively looked at the rules of civil procedure, and there's a law in the United States called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976, and it, not surprisingly, says, you can tell by the title, that foreign states are immune from lawsuits. So you can't sue a foreign state in the United States, except, and it has certain exceptions, and one of the exceptions, which hadn't been used very much at the time, was that you can sue a foreign state in a case concerning property taken in violation of international law, where the property is owned or operated by an agency or instrumentality of a foreign state that is engaged in a commercial activity in the United States. Okay, so taken in violation of international law, that should be okay, the Nazis, right? owned or operated by an agency or instrumentality. Okay, the Austrian Gallery it's an agency, it's a federal museum that's engaged in activity in the United States. All I had to do was find some commercial activity in the United States. So they had published a guidebook with Yale University Press. They had advertised, they accepted US credit cards. I thought, okay, we can sue Austria in the United States, why not? So my firm was not interested in this. They were not in the business of tilting at windmills and suing foreign states on crazy cases. And so I actually left my firm. It was right before my second child was born. And a few weeks later, I did my first thing at my new firm. I filed a lawsuit for Maria Altmann against Austria. And everybody thought we were insane. And it was a little bit crazy, I have to admit. But who knew, right, where it would end up? And so Austria then hired a nice Jewish firm in New York, Proskauer Rose, for a sort of famously Jewish firm in New York, and to defend them here in Los Angeles. And I think they thought the lawyer was Jewish too, Scott Cooper, but he was Catholic. Anyway, he did what any lawyer would do. He filed a motion to dismiss the case for 10 different reasons. And we had a great judge, Florence Marie Cooper, also named Cooper, and she miraculously, she denied their motion to dismiss in its entirety. So that was very unexpected. No one really believed it would happen, but I thought we had good legal arguments, so that I was fighting for it. And then Austria had the right to appeal because it was a sovereign immunity issue. So they appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit, again, like a miracle, ruled in our favor and said we could proceed with the case. So we were very happy. But then the US government got involved. Apparently they didn't like the precedent that we had just set, and other countries were complaining about it. And so they filed a brief asking the Ninth Circuit to reconsider and reverse its decision, which thankfully the Ninth Circuit didn't. But then when Austria petitioned the Supreme Court to hear the case, the Supreme Court agreed. And so we had to go to Washington and argue. I had to argue for the first time for me in the United States Supreme Court against not just Austria, but the United States government in this case. And here's a picture of me and Maria in Washington in 2004. Everybody in the world thought we were going to lose. I was not overconfident myself. And I remember having sort of a gallows humor going into it. And when I finally got up to speak, I was the last one because we had won in the lower court. So I had heard what had happened with the previous lawyers for the US and Austria. And so I was feeling pretty good. And I got up to speak and I started my argument. I said, there are 4 grounds for affirming the Ninth Circuit. Ground 1 is, and as soon as I finished my first sentence, I was interrupted because that's what they do at the Supreme Court. They interrupt you with questions. You can listen to this, by the way, on oas.org if you want to. But I was interrupted by Justice Souter, who's probably the smartest judge at the Supreme Court at that time. And he asked this long, convoluted question that sounded to me like da 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 da. Like I had no idea what he was talking about, none. And you can hear it on the tape if you want it. I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't think I understood the question. Could you please rephrase it? And all the other justices smiled as if to say, oh, thank God you asked. He does that all the time. We didn't understand it either. It was the perfect icebreaker. You would have thought, like it had been a disaster, but it was actually the best possible answer I could have given. He was very gracious. He rephrased it. I sort of understood what he was trying to say and then moved on. And the rest of the argument went like a dream. The best thing that's ever happened to me. I floated out of the court. My dad, a retired judge who was always a little bit negative on the case, said, you might even have a chance. And I, my goal was just to have at least one judge on our side, so everyone didn't think I was completely crazy. So I returned home, but the headline in the legal newspaper out here in Los Angeles was "Court likely to reverse Altmann case," and it was all about how we were going to lose. And I called up the journalist and said, no one got to see it. Couldn't you have at least said, Randy did a good job, but court likely to reverse? But he said, no, I've been doing this for 40 years. There's no way. I can tell by the body language, it's all over. So I said, okay, you're going to find out first, because they don't even tell the lawyers when they're doing a decision. They just announce. I said, can you do me a favor? Can you call me when it happens? So sure enough, 3 months later in June, I get a call from this journalist. I'm making breakfast for the kids. And he says, this is Dave Pike. And I said, okay, so what's the bad news? He said, not bad news, you won. You won 6-3 decision. I think I dropped the phone because I couldn't believe it. And I quickly got everything ready and I went over to Maria's because her phone was busy already. And And I went there and we kissed and hugged, and her family came over, we were celebrating. And then after a while, we realized, what were we celebrating? We had just won the right to start the case. We were at step one, basically. We had won the right just to begin the case. So we entered sort of the normal litigation mode, which lasted almost 2 years. And finally, we had an arbitration because we had mediated, as was required in Austria, finally agreed to resolve the case through an arbitration, which is something, when they proposed it, I thought, oh, this is great. This is what I'd asked them to do in 1999. And Maria said, are you crazy? Why would I take this case back to Austria? All the judges here love us, and I'm here in Los Angeles. And I said to Maria, you're almost 90 years old by now. If you want this case decided in your lifetime, we need to take this risk and go back and get it over with, because they could drag it out forever. It wasn't even clear whether Austria would recognize a US judgment if we had won. So I said, we have to take this chance. And thankfully, she stuck with me. And I went back to Austria and then did a 3-judge arbitration. It was not like in the movie. There was no audience. It was just the judges and the lawyers. And we waited then. We waited for a number of months. There were rumors that we were going to lose, of course. And then finally, in January 2006, I got an email at midnight coming home from a poker game on Sunday night. And the email, I raced to my computer to open it up, and it said we won. All 3 of the arbitrators agreed with my position, which was Maria's father's position. This will was just a wish. It was just precatory. It wasn't binding on Ferdinand. And for very understandable reasons, after what had happened to him and his family, he did not give these paintings to the Austrian gallery. They were instead traded after the war in 1948 by Dr. Rinesh in exchange for export permits for other paintings. And as a result, under the new law, they had to be returned. So then we really did celebrate. And I'll just give a little bit of a denouement here. The paintings, what do you do when all of a sudden you're given 5 fabulously valuable Klimt paintings? So I called up Stephanie Barron at the LA County Museum of Art and said, how'd you like to do an exhibit? And she said, sure thing. And so we got the paintings out of Dodge very fast and brought them to Los Angeles in April 2006. And there's Maria. And that was really, for me, the best part of the whole thing, because she could be there with her whole family and enjoy these pictures. They had been in one room in her uncle's house. Maria said she went over there every weekend. They used to have dinner there, and there was sort of a memorial room with flowers in the middle with all of these paintings. And it was really just a tremendous, tremendous thing. The painting, the gold portrait, was then purchased by Ronald Lauder for the Neue Gallery on 86th and 5th. So those of you in New York should definitely go see it if you haven't already. You see the 2 statues next to it there. Those are 2 statues by Gustav Klimt. Those were also returned to the family in 2007 because they found this picture from 100 years earlier, where in the first exhibit of the gold portrait, and they were able to identify these statues that ended up in the Austrian gallery as ones that were on Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer's list. Without a photograph or a name, it's sometimes hard to identify, but this was pretty clear. So they were donated to the Neue Gallery, so you can see them just as they were when the gold portrait was just first exhibited. And then the paintings, the rest of the paintings were auctioned off at Christie's later that year. So it really was, for me, the case was always about telling the story. And for Maria too, I remember when we went to the Supreme Court, we just said, we're probably going to lose, but at least now everybody will know what happened to you and your family and these amazing paintings. And that was really the prime motivation of it. And it just was just the most amazing and fortunate thing in my life to be able to represent someone like Maria Altmann in this incredible case. So I want to thank you all for listening. I think we have enough time. I'm right on time, right? It's 11:44. We have enough time for some questions, and I don't know if I guess Jory is going to read them to me, or if other people are going to go live, but I hope everyone was there. It's a little hard sometimes on the screen, just staring at a screen and hoping that there are people in the audience, but I hope enough people were there to listen and enjoy the story, and I'm here for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randy. This is such a fascinating case, and it was really just a treat to hear it in such great detail. There's definitely people here. We've been getting a lot of questions. I think one of the most compelling ideas about this is the fact that there's so many more cases like this that are just so complicated and tangled in legality. Do you have a sense of the scope, of how many Nazi looted artworks exist in the world?
It's a good question. The question sort of depends on how you define an artwork, right? There are 6 million people murdered. Everybody has stuff, right? They have furniture and art on the walls and drawings and paintings and prints and jewelry and all sorts of things. So it's really endless if you look at it that way. It's really only these very highly valuable things that are worth spending, in this case, 8 years trying to recover. So it's really as endless as you want. I guess we still have the slides up, right? So I can show you some of the other ones that, like this one belonged to Bernard Altmann, was returned. This one is a Canaletto, also from Bernard Altmann's collection. Bernard Altmann, as I mentioned, this is Maria's brother-in-law, fled immediately. His entire house, everything in it, was auctioned off with the catalog in June 1938. Let me explain that again. The Nazis arrived in March, and by June, they had an order with a public auction with a printed catalog. Okay, that's just, if anybody in Europe says, oh, we can't do it, it takes too long, right, for us to do it, just remind them that it only took them 3 months to take all of Bernard Altmann's property. He had 4 paintings by Canaletto. 1 has been recovered, okay? Wow. And these are, they're very, very, very valuable paintings. 2 of them, we even have a photograph in the catalog, so we know exactly what they look like. They have not reappeared yet. They will at some point. So there are still a lot of these type of artworks out there.
You said that, was it Justice Souter? Was that his name?
Yeah.
You said that he asked a very long-winded question, but then rephrased it. What was the rephrased question?
I had said that it was, there was an issue whether the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act was sort of procedural or substantive, and whether it operated retrospectively or just on the case that was in front of it. Right, so when you say a court has jurisdiction, is it really retroactive? That was the issue, is whether it was impermissibly retroactive was the legal issue, whether it affected things in the 30s and 40s. And you could say that a jurisdictional statute that just says the court has jurisdiction doesn't really care when the thing happened. It's really operating now. And so that was the question. He said, well, couldn't you as easily say that it isn't operating now because it talks about something earlier? Anyway, you can listen on oyez.org. It was really, really complicated. It's still complicated when you listen to it.
I was going to say, it sounds just as complicated.
It is completely incomprehensible. And the correct answer was, huh? What are you talking about? And that was the right answer. And that's why I won the case, I think. So listen to it. If you disagree, write me an email and you can explain it.
We're getting a lot of questions about, I think this idea of justice is really just so moving and endearing. I think people want to know, were any of the Altmann's possessions returned to them? Like, did Maria keep any of the artworks? I know that many were donated, but.
Yeah, so the Klimts were just too valuable for any person to keep in their home. Right. I mean, imagine you're a 90-year-old woman. Do you want a $50 million painting in your home, right? You'd have to have armed guards around 24/7. And they're museum pieces. They really belong in the museum. They're popular works, and so. But the family didn't feel like that they should be given to a museum after what had happened over 60 years. So they ended up selling them. She did have other paintings in her house. Yeah, she had some of these other older paintings. The Franz Eibel was the one. I don't have a picture of it, but there was one I remember over her, sort of above her mantle. And she had lots of artworks. Her parents had collected, not like those porcelain settings, but sort of antique watches with all these watches. There are sort of pendant watches. And there was the one I really liked was a skull. And you could open up, it was from the 1600s, you could open up the skull and there was a little timepiece. So she had terrific things in her home, but the Klimts, it was enough for her to have a poster.
Good enough. Several people have asked, and I don't know the answer to this either, if Klimt was Jewish.
Klimt was not Jewish, but a lot of it, as I mentioned, a lot of his patrons were.
Was there anything that initially struck you about this case? I know you said that many people thought that it wasn't winnable, but Was there like a glimmer of hope at any point that you
You know,
really
I always thought that that it was winnable, and because I thought we were right? I mean, it wasn't that I had invented the idea. Maria's father in 1926 said, "This is not binding," right? So, and they were always relying on that, right? And after the war, they said, "Adele gave it to us," and then even in 1999, they said, "Adele gave it to us." And I looked at the will and I said, like, that's not really what it says. It says, "I ask," and there are other places, by the way, in the will where he says, she says, "I command you to do this and I direct you to do that." So it was as a matter of construction, they were wrong. And I thought, you know, there's got to be a way to rectify that. You can't just rely on something wrong to do something like this. And so I always had a feeling we could win if we got to the merits of it. But there are a lot of problems in getting to the merits, and this sovereign immunity issue is one of them. Would have been statute of limitations or the active state doctrine or other hurdles that we would have had to get over, and that always worried me. So I was not very confident.
Is there still a statute of limitations on the other artworks that were involved in this suit?
So statute of limitations would have been an issue. There had been a new California statute of limitations that extended the time. There's a new federal one, actually. But that California one was declared unconstitutional in the case involving the Cranach paintings in Pasadena wrongly on a 2-1 decision. And so we could have lost on that issue at that time. At any one of these issues, we could have lost. So it's really sort of a miracle that we got to the end.
Again, just going back to this idea of justice, we received a couple questions. People just want to get involved and help, and right or wrong when they see it. Someone asked, what can the public do to urge other museums or institutions to turn over artwork that isn't rightfully theirs, which is a great
it's a really good question. I think it's always a little puzzling to me, but I guess if you work in a museum, so you can tell me, when you work in a museum, and I was president of a museum also, you get this feeling like it's yours. You own the stuff inside it. Not that it's sort of a public trust. And so I think a lot of museum directors, they feel they can't do this. They can't give something back up because their job is to keep it at all costs in the museum. And that, I think those type of people would respond to more public pressure. Norton Simon is a perfect example where they have 2 Cranach paintings that were, do I have a picture of them? Let me see if I have a picture of them. There they are. These were stolen in Holland. The original owner fled on a boat and died. He fell in, their high seas, and he fell and died on the boat. He had a young wife, also Jewish, and with a baby who made it to New York, and she tried to get his paintings back after the war from Holland and was pushed away. They kept 200 artworks from her husband. As Houtsticker is the name. 200 works. Right after our Klimt decision, the Dutch decided to return all of those, 198 of them, to the family as being wrongly withheld from her. But these 2 they had sold in the 1960s to a Count Stroganoff, who had claimed that they were wrongly claimed that they were taken from his family in Russia. So they settled with him and sold them, and Stroganoff sold it to Norton Simon, and they're sitting in Pasadena. So these are 100% looted paintings that were taken by Hermann Goering. They're some of the ones found by the monuments men. They are 100% stolen paintings from a Jewish family. They're in Pasadena, in Los Angeles, in the Norton Simon Museum, and they said the statute of limitations was wrong, and they finally won on the active state doctrine, which I think the court misapplied. I'm sure they misapplied it, but they did, and the Supreme Court wouldn't review it. And so the active state doctrine says we're not going to look at what a foreign state did. So Holland, if they had kept these, they would have returned them, but they sold them, and we're not going to review that and fight over it, even though the paintings are here in Pasadena and has nothing to do with Holland. And that's a type of case where public outcry could, I think, do something, because they really should give these back. They shouldn't have fought on all of these sort of irrelevant legal theories, right? Statute of limitations, active state doctrine does not change the fact that these paintings belong to a Jewish family, were taken by Hermann Goering and never returned, right? That's it. The facts are the facts. So anyway, I think public pressure could do something on these and in other cases. So the question is how to do that.
Right. To give a bit of reassurance, I know it's fairly common practice now that museums have very rigorous acquisition committees that vet artworks and really do their best to search for the source,
Yeah.
instead of just working directly with the dealer. So I think that practice is being sort of phased out and replaced with more thorough, investigations. But yeah, but I think we are almost out of time. So just thank you so much.
There are some other questions I could answer.
Oh,
quickly.
are there? Sorry.
I go down the Q&A.
Yeah, feel free.
There's a new case going up to the Supreme Court, the Gulf Treasures. We'll see what happens to it. It's also being decided on sort of technical issues. So I'm not sure how that is going to play out. And it has to do with whether it's a violation of foreign law, I think, to take from your own citizens, even under the Nazi period. Okay, so that's answer to one.
Sorry, I didn't scroll up.
Someone wants to watch the film. I don't know if it's on Netflix or Amazon. I hope it is still. It was, for better or worse, Harvey Weinstein was one of the executive producers, so God knows what's up with his stuff. Where's the portrait in Mannheim, 1907? Sorry, the gold portrait. That's the one was in Mannheim. Okay, let's see. And we touched with Maria's family. Yes, I even heard from Peter, who was hoping to be a part of this the presentation, but didn't get back to us. And he's wondering whether to apply for Austrian citizenship, because as of yesterday, there's a new law that allows descendants of Austrians to get citizenship. I already got mine earlier under an earlier law, but he's wondering what to do that. So yes, I'm in touch with them. Was I compensated for my time? Yes, ultimately I received a huge windfall, because Maria and I had agreed that if we won, we would split the proceeds like a contingency fee case. And so I was grossly compensated, more money than anybody ever should have to get. But that's of course allowed me to do a lot of other things, like helping build the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, which I did, and I do a lot of genealogy, and now I do a lot of dishwashing and cooking and stuff for my kids, which is
admirable, very admirable.
So let's see, did they keep any of the paintings? I think you asked that. Am I still practicing law? Not much. There are a couple of paintings I'm still hoping to get back, but I'm really not practicing law anymore, which I miss it a little bit. And I have a case going on against the FBI over the Clinton search warrant, which you can contact me separately if you want to hear about that, not related to art. Were they able to get their homes back? Yes, the home was also returned. Ferdinand's home was another procedure, and we also got that back. Not the one in Czechoslovakia. They never got any property back in Czechoslovakia, zero, which is a real problem in all of the Eastern European countries. Let's see. What other questions? Yeah, there's a lot of them. Let's see. What happened to Maria's parents? This one is worth in 1 minute saying. Maria's mother escaped with the sons and went to Vancouver. Maria's father, actually, contrary to what's in the film, he died over the summer while Fritz was in Dachau in 1938. And when they did if you saw the film, it's really one of the heart-rending scenes in the middle and end of the film when Maria leaves her parents. And I always thought of that as sort of, artistic license and fiction. And then I did a talk on the film, and someone came up to me and said, that scene moved me so much, because of course that happened to my parents. And I thought, you know what, my grandfather had the same thing. My grandfather fled from Vienna and never saw his parents again. And I realized that the film, even in fictionalizing a little bit of Maria's story, had managed to represent the story of so many of the other families, including my own, during that time. So I really appreciate that about the film. Even though there's a lot of artistic license, it's all based on true things that happened either to Maria or to other people. So anyway, thank you very much for attending. I think we're just coming up on an hour. And thank you, Jory, for managing this whole thing. I think that's terrific.
Thank you so much. And of course, thank you to our members for joining us today and for your generosity. It's been just so meaningful these last couple of months. We're truly grateful. And thank you to Randy for inviting us to go behind the scenes in this fascinating case. We'll be offering virtual members-only programs every month, even when our doors reopen next week. So please look for invitations to register for these and more in your member newsletter, which, by the way, is going out on Sunday this week because Labor Day is on Monday and we are closed. So thank you again so much for joining us. And take care. Have a great rest of your day, Randy.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.